Jesus, we believe and confess, fully reveals both God and humanity to us. What was previously misunderstood or unknown about God, Jesus comes to clear up. The story of the Old Testament is in fact the story of God's people getting to know their God. He reveals himself to them in different ways through the law and the prophets and signs and wonders and revelations and all of those things, yet not fully until we get to Jesus. Jesus comes and it's like, oh, okay, this is what God is like. This is what the heart of God is all about. This is God's character. We can see that now in Jesus. He reveals God. And the second thing he does is reveals humanity. We've been talking about this through this series. He reveals humanity to us. Oh, this is what we as humans should live like. God designed us and has a path for us to walk, but many of us take the wrong path doing the wrong things. And we look to Jesus for us to see, in fact, how we ought to live. In Jesus' life, he doesn't dominate over people, rather he serves people. He doesn't get revenge or retaliation on those, he rather forgives them. He does not hate and fight against his enemies. In fact, he loves his enemies. All of these things are challenging to us as we look and follow Jesus. We want to be a church, a people who are following Jesus. It says it this way in the book of Hebrews. This has been our theme verse really for this series. I've read it, I think, almost every Sunday of this series. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Hopefully by the end of the series, maybe many of us have memorized that verse. We've read those 3 verses each series, and it's a reminder that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. Jesus, the Son of God, passing through the heavens, yet entering into our story. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. Humbling himself, experience, he says, sympathizing with our weaknesses. We as humans have weaknesses. Whether we want to admit that or not, we do. And it says Jesus can sympathize, meaning he's been there. He's experienced these things. It says Jesus has been tempted in every respect as we are, yet he has remained without sin. And so again, for us, when we as humans experience life, the ups and the downs, we've been focusing in on the emotions or the human experiences through this series, we're able to look beside us and to see Jesus there. That he sympathizes with us because he has been there. He has experienced these things. We've talked about the sorrow that Jesus experienced, the joy, the anger. Last week we looked, it wasn't really an emotion, but the fatigue, the tiredness, the exhaustion, which often we can relate to. It's part of the human experience. And when we experience these things, the highs and lows of life, we're able to look to Jesus to see how we ought to respond. See, because when we experience the ups and the downs, oftentimes it leads us to sin, to respond in our anger or in our tiredness or in our frustration or sorrow and do things we ought not to do or say things we ought not to say. Yet Jesus has experienced all of these things, the heights and the lows, the ups and the downs, and yet he has remained without sin. And so once again, we look to Jesus. Today, we've talked about many emotions, and today we're moving into talk about anxiety. It is perhaps one of the more, as we'll look into the scriptures today, one of the more challenging, perhaps even controversial emotions of Jesus. And maybe you're going to be left wrestling with, did Jesus, was he really anxious? Did he really feel anxiety? We're going to talk about that today. But anxiety is a problem for many of us. Anxiety is understood. I want us to kind of to wrap our head around it. We talked about joy a few weeks ago, and joy is this picture of wholeness, completeness, this abundant life that God has designed for us. This is how we really are to understand joy in the biblical context. Anxiety is really the opposite of that. It's this feeling of incomplete, not whole. Something's missing. Something's out of alignment, and we feel it. Anxiety itself is not just simply an emotion alone. I have anxiety. Rather, anxiety is this swelling of many emotions that weigh on us, that sit heavy on our shoulders. And we can feel anxiety in many different ways. Maybe today as you've come in, you're anxious about success. what you thought you were going to do or accomplish, or here's who I'm going to be, here's my picture of success, and now your life doesn't really line up, doesn't really look like what you thought it should or would. And it causes you anxiety. Maybe your anxiety is in relationships. Maybe a spouse or kids, a neighbor or a coworker, someone that you have tension with. You're not getting along well. You have arguments with, and especially those that are close to us, our spouse and our kids. Those people tend to, it causes an anxiety when we have stress, tension in these relationships. Maybe today you have anxiety from broken relationships in your life. Maybe your anxiety comes from finances. Can I get an amen? Maybe you don't have enough money to pay the bills, to get the groceries, to get the new thing that you need to get to pay the rent, and it's just weighing on you. It's a stress. Anxious about finances. Maybe that's you today. Ultimately, you can kind of wrap all these together. Anxiety, as we're going to see, is ultimately trying to keep up. Trying to keep up with those that are around us. We're always looking not down as much, the people that long to have what we have. We tend to just look up at the things that we don't have, the people that have the stuff that's better than us. Man, I wish I had a car like theirs. I wish I had a house like theirs. I wish I got to wear clothes like theirs or had nice shoes like them. It's about keeping up and what we believe we should be doing or should be accomplishing. These are the things altogether that weigh on us, oftentimes that we call anxiety. Ultimately, for us, anxiety is dissatisfaction, and it's not experiencing, like I said, the wholeness of God, the wholeness that God desires for my life, for your life. God does desire this. And so today, as we've been doing, we're going to look to Jesus. And in this series, as we've been doing, we come across tension in the Scriptures, and that's okay. We don't run from that. We're going to step into that. There's tension is that we see Jesus reveals God and reveals humanity. We see a verse, for instance, like Isaiah that says, God does not grow weary, nor does he faint. Amen. But then we look to Jesus and it says Jesus was weary. Jesus fully God, yet fully human. We see Jesus say, hey, do not be angry with your brother, lest judgment comes upon you. And then we see Jesus angry. There's a tension there. And that's okay. We see Jesus experience the sorrow. We see Jesus experience the joy. He lives in that tension as he is both fully God and fully human. And so, for instance, Jesus teaches this, Matthew chapter 6. We preached about this a few months ago, back through the Jesus Way series as we looked at the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says this, in fact, therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is life not more than food, and the body more than clothing? Now that passage goes on, and Jesus will give a few examples, but I want us to be reminded of this. We preached through this again a few months ago, but I want us to be reminded that Jesus isn't here neglecting those that need the basic necessities of life. What he's saying is, do not be anxious about what you eat or what you drink or what you put on, what you wear. He's not saying don't be anxious that you eat, or that you drink, or that you have something to put on. No, God cares, and especially Jesus, as he demonstrates and reveals God to us, cares about the least of these that struggle in that area to not have what they need to have in their life. It's why Jesus' ministry was often directed at the least of these, as we see in Scripture, the poor, the hurting, the hungry, the broken. Jesus does care, and those type of things do weigh on us. What Jesus is saying is that as we experience anxiety, he says, don't worry about what you eat, what you drink, what you wear, because when we get to that place, then we're comparing ourselves. It's the difference between this. If I come across a homeless man on the side of the road and I want to give him a pack of crackers, here's some peanut butter crackers to eat, and he's like, nah, I don't want that. I want like a steak or something. And it's like, okay, he needs this. I want us to understand the difference versus something that we want. Jesus in this message is teaching that we don't have anxiety about the things that we want, about how they compare to others. Don't be nervous about what you have, what you eat, comparing it to someone else. Be thankful, rather, that you have something to eat, that you have something to drink, that you have something to wear. This is kind of the basis for us to understand this teaching of Jesus, especially as we're going to look now to an example, a story of Jesus feeling these things, feeling this anxiety that we're going to look at today. So let us step in. This comes from Luke chapter 22. Let's read together. And he came out and went, as was his custom, this is Jesus, to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." Perhaps a story that you've heard before. Jesus, I want us to understand the context of what's going on. This is the very last night of Jesus' life. Jesus has had his ministry for 3 years, roughly. He has come into town, into Jerusalem on the donkey. That was this past Sunday in reference to this story. He's done many things throughout this week, and here it is Thursday night. He's gathered together with his disciples, and they've had the Last Supper. He's taught them, and they had dialogue, and they had this exchange in the room as they had the Last Supper together. And then now Jesus, into the late night hours, pulls away with his disciples to go to where it says is his custom, where he's prayed before. This is the Garden of Gethsemane, right there on the Mount of Olives. Most of the pictures you may see of Jerusalem are probably taken from the Mount of Olives. It's a great picture as the hill goes down and then it rises back up to the city. When you see that landscape, even now, this is where Jesus is. He's right there on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he goes there to pray. This was his custom, and now he's doing it again. And he tells the disciples in verse 40 to pray that they do not fall into temptation. You guys stay here and pray and do not fall into temptation. And Jesus, it says, goes a little further away. Why does Jesus say this to his disciples? What is Jesus really getting at? Is this just kind of a general, don't be tempted kind of sermon that he throws at them real quick? Or what is Jesus really talking about? Again, I want us to understand what all is going on and not miss the importance of this story. Jesus has been in his ministry with these disciples about 3 years. He's walked with them and talked with them. He's taught them. He's discipled them. He's included them. He's been with them life on life together, Jesus with his disciples. And he's now come to this moment that is almost this breaking point. Jesus knows a lot is about to go down in the next few hours. Imminently, Jesus is about to be betrayed and arrested, tried, mocked, beaten, a cross thrown on his back, and him crucified, murdered. Jesus knows this is all about to happen, and he's praying for his disciples that they will respond the right way as he's been preparing them for this moment. That they wouldn't do things the wrong way. Do not fall into temptation. In fact, there's two conversations that happen just before this. We won't read them today, but they're just before this in the Gospel of Luke. While they're gathered together in the upper room, so think an hour earlier, 2 hours before, the disciples are gathered there and they have this conversation of who is the greatest? Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? They're having this discussion amongst themselves. And again, I want us to understand their perspective. The disciples have come into town with Jesus and they're ready for Jesus to be king. The great Messiah, King of Jerusalem, King of Israel, King of the world, if you want to look at it that way. These disciples are anticipating Jesus to be overthrowing the Roman Empire and become king as he has been prophesied to become. And so they're figuring out their position. They're jockeying for position. Oh, I want this position. I want this one. I want to be as high as I can. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus has to rebuke them to say it's not the one that dominates over another. Rather, it is the one who serves the least of these. The one who serves and loves one another. This is the greatest in my kingdom. See, the disciples still didn't fully get it. Maybe you're here today and you've been following Jesus for some time, many years. Maybe you've been following him for just a short time, or maybe you're still deciding, figuring that out, thinking through if you want to follow Jesus. But nevertheless, maybe you're feeling like, I don't know enough. Maybe I feel like I should know more by now. There's still things I'm confused about, I'm uncertain about, and I want you to know you're in good company. You fit right in with these disciples, who after had still been with Jesus for 3 years, still didn't fully understand Jesus' words, his message, his kingdom at this point, and they're jockeying for position. The next conversation zooms in a little more. It's just with Simon Peter. Perhaps the greatest disciple, you could argue, definitely the oldest, the one that would speak first, as was their custom, and him being the oldest. There's more words of Peter than more than likely all the other disciples. And Peter tells Jesus, because it's all about to go down, and Peter's getting excited, and he's like, Jesus, I'm ready to go to war with you. Let's do this. I'm ready to go to prison. I'm ready to go to the death with you, Jesus. Let's do it. Like Peter's pumped up. He's got his sword out. Maybe he's got his guns out. Whatever, he's just ready to fight. This is how he understood how he ought to follow Jesus. Jesus, he says, I'll go to the death with you. I'll go to prison with you. And Jesus then again rebukes Peter. He says, Peter, in fact, you will deny me 3 times. You're going to deny me 3 times before the sun rises, before the rooster crows. You will deny me. Jesus has just had these conversations with his disciples. He comes out to the garden to pray with them, and he says, pray that you do not fall into temptation. Let's do not do things the wrong way. I want you to understand what I'm doing, what this death is about, the kingdom that I'm bringing, and then how we get to help fulfill that, bring that to life. This is what he's challenging the disciples with. I love the detail that Luke gives. The next verse, it says, Jesus goes about a stone's throw away. Maybe it depends on who's throwing the stone, 50 feet, 100 feet, 300 feet if you've got a real arm. But Jesus goes about a stone's throw away. Enough where he can see them, but yet he's far enough away to pray kind of by himself, Luke tells us. And it says that he kneels down. He knelt down to pray. And maybe this seems normal for you. That seems pretty elementary. Let's kneel to pray. Yet I want us to understand too that in this time, in Jesus' day, with the Pharisees, with the scribes, with perhaps many rabbis, their posture of prayer was not to kneel, it was to stand. When they would pray, they would stand before the Lord, oftentimes with their hands like this. Sometimes if you even go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, you can see this now, they'll move their whole body as they pray. It was typical for someone to stand, especially a rabbi like Jesus. Yet Jesus in this moment, we're not let in quite yet, we're getting there, but Jesus is feeling the weight of the moment, and he in fact goes away and kneels down, falls down on his knees to pray. And he prays something very interesting. Verse 42 says this, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. There's a theological term I want to share with you today. It's called the hypostatic union. The hypostatic union. And this is our attempt, the church's attempt, to best understand Jesus as both fully God and fully man. Now, I'll be honest with you, as I said before, we cannot fully grasp that concept. We can do our best. And theologians have studied this and thought through this and debated this for 2,000 some odd years. And what we've come up with as the church, as theologians, as Christian doctrine, it's called the hypostatic union. It's really what this whole series has been about in some ways, though I haven't told you that's the word. It's understanding that Jesus is both fully God and yet simultaneously fully human. And Jesus in this moment is praying, God, if there's another way, God, if there's another way, can we do that way? Can we do another way? God, can we do something else? Jesus is praying. Kneeling down, can you remove this cup from me? This cup being these steps he's about to take to be crucified, murdered, tortured in the coming hours. God, if there's another way, let's do that. But Jesus says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And maybe you've heard this before, and as we hear it, we can think, well, did Jesus and God, the Father, have like different plans? Was there a different idea going on? Were they in disagreement? Like Jesus is going, I had my plan, and I guess this is not what we're going to do, so God will go with your plan, God the Father. Are they opposed? Are they different in their understanding of what the plan is, what their will is? I want us to not miss this. They are not misaligned, God the Father and God the Son. That is not what this moment is about. Rather, this is that hypostatic union we're talking about. Jesus having the will, the divine will of God, and simultaneously a human will, both present in Jesus. And this is the temptation that we can often face, is to know, well, he's God, but he's not really human. I've said this a few times throughout this series. He's God, yes, that makes sense, but he's not really human. He's just kind of dressed up like a human. He just got the human outfit on. He just put some skin on, but he's not really a human. I want us to see in this moment, I don't want us to skip over it. This is the back and forth between Jesus' divine will and Jesus' human will. In his human will, Jesus has just prayed and is feeling, Lord, can we do another way? Is there a way to get out of this? I don't want us to skip over and over-spiritualize this. This is Jesus fully in his humanity, feeling the weight of all that's on his shoulders, knelt down, praying intensely to God the Father to see if there's a way to get out of this. It's weighing heavy on Jesus. In his humanity, it weighs on him so heavy. So heavy, in fact, that God the Father, it says, sends an angel. The next verse. And an angel came to him to strengthen him. This is now the second time we've seen an angel or angels come to Jesus to minister or strengthen to him. We looked at it last week. Near the beginning of his ministry, Jesus goes into the wilderness and prays and fasts. He's tempted by the Satan. And then afterwards, angels, it says, comes and ministers to him. A mystical verse. I love it. Angels came and were ministering to Jesus. And now we see this again. In this difficult hour as he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he is crucified, it says that God the Father sees him in the state and angels come. God the Father no doubt sends an angel to come to Jesus. It says to strengthen him. How does Jesus, fully God, need to be strengthened? He's fully God. How can he need to be strengthened? Yet again, this is Jesus fully human at the same time. And God the Father sees God the Son, Jesus Christ, feeling what he's feeling, the weight on his shoulders, and he sends an angel to strengthen him, to be present with him. The next verse, verse 44 says, and being in agony, he prayed, and sweat like drops of blood fell to the ground. And being in agony, that Greek word there is agonia. Agonia. In fact, literally it translates either as agony or perhaps anguish, or here it is, anxiety. Agony, anguish, anxiety. This is what Jesus is feeling in this moment. And in fact, it's pretty peculiar. This is the only place in the Scriptures that this word is used. Jesus in agony. This is the only place. It's the only time this Greek word is used in the New Testament. Jesus is feeling the weight of all this. I want us to see him pull away a stone's throw, fall down to his face on his knees, kneeling and praying so intently, it says that sweat, like drops of blood, began to fall from his face to the ground. This is what Jesus is going through. This agony, this anguish, this anxiety, as all of the weight of the world, it seems, sits on his shoulders. This is Jesus feeling this, fully human. The anguish that sits on him. Maybe you have experienced anguish in this way, panic in this way. I don't know if you've ever had or experienced a panic attack, an anxiety attack. I've spoken to some of you, and I know some of you in the room have experienced this. It's this phenomenon where the weight of different emotions that you can't always even identify fully sits heavy on your shoulders, and it causes a physical response. As you've told me, you've had to pull the car over to the side of the road and stop. You lock up. You have to intently focus on your breathing. Maybe you have experienced this before, an anxiety attack, a panic attack. I believe that Jesus, in some ways in his humanity, is experiencing something similar as he is sweating intently. Whether you want to believe literally that the sweat turns into drops of blood, and some theologians do agree with that, or whether you think it's just sweat that's like drops of blood falling. Either way, he's sweating profusely, knelt down, praying in agony, enough for God the Father to send an angel to him. This is the picture of what's going on. Jesus fully experiencing anxiety. So why is Jesus feeling these things? Why is Jesus experiencing these things? I think the Apostle Paul explains it well for us. The book of Philippians chapter 2 says it this way. Let each of you, this is verse 4, you won't see this one, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. That's certainly what Jesus is all about, as he is going to the cross for others. Verse 5, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, this is Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death upon a cross. Jesus, again, fully God, connected in unity with God the Father from all times past, in heaven on the throne, and he looks down upon humanity to see us in our plight, us in our struggle. And he says God did not count equality with him something to be grasped. That word grasp, literally more translated, means to be taken advantage of, to be exploited. Jesus did not count that something to be exploited or taken advantage of and say, well, man, they're struggling down there, but I hope they figure it out. No, that would be to take advantage of this position. Rather, he says, no, I will empty myself. Maybe the most loaded word in all of the Bible. Jesus, fully God, it says, empties himself. What all does that mean? We'll wrestle with that for all eternity. Or we'll wrestle for that on this side of eternity. God empties himself, taking on the very form of a servant, being born as a human. And when I say servant, just as a reminder, this is Jesus entering into the very system that he has created. He goes and becomes a human, and now, like I said before, he's got to walk to get from one place to the other. He speaks a certain language. He's hot underneath the sun. He sweats. He has to eat and sleep and go to the bathroom. He has to be a human. This is part of God emptying himself to become a human like us. It says that he was obedient to become a human. And I want us to see the full experience of humanity. Jesus enters into this world the same way that you and I did, through the womb of our mother. Jesus wasn't, again, zapped down to earth at 30 years old to just walk around and preach and teach. No, he enters into our story fully, born of his mother. And then it says he grew in wisdom and stature among God and among men. He had to learn to walk and to talk and to reason and to think. And all of the things, Jesus has, again, fully become human, not just playing a part, not just playing a role, fully human as he grows to become a man. And it says that he became obedient to the point of death. Jesus was only going to get out of this story the same way you and I get out, and that's through death. He knew that once he became a human, the only way out was through death, and ultimately he was crucified. He was killed. It said he was obedient to the point of death, even death upon a cross. A cross is where you're tortured, where you're hung there and you can't breathe until you die. Jesus would take all of this on in these coming hours after this story, where he would be beaten with clubs and spit upon, and a crown of thorns pressed down upon his head, whipped until a moment of his life, nailed to a cross, and lifted up until dead. Why is Jesus experiencing this pain, this agony in this moment? It's because that he had decided he was going to be obedient even to the point of death on a cross, as Paul tells us here. This is why we celebrate Jesus, that he goes before us, that he enters into death, that he might defeat death by death. And yes, we'll get there when we get to Easter. But for today, we're looking at his humanity. This is why Jesus is feeling these things as he has emptied himself fully into our story to become a human, that he might heal us and save us. And so as we close today, I want us to look at two quick verses just to bring some clarity and context what we might ought to learn. This is from Mark. This is Mark's perspective, the Gospel of Mark, on the same story. This is Mark's perspective. I want us to see the difference here. Verse 32. What do we got? 32 through 35. And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. This is the account that Mark gives us. Luke, a great physician that gives us great detail and is writing primarily to a Gentile audience. Mark, on the other hand, John Mark, got his account most likely from the apostle Peter, as he gathered that from Peter while Peter sat in a prison in Rome. This is the first gospel written, Mark, and this is Mark's account of the very same story. And I want us to see the very difference that we see is this inclusion of Jesus bringing along three of his closest friends, Peter, James, and John. He says he brings the disciples there, and then a little further along, him and Peter and James and John. This is the closest three disciples, Jesus' inner three. Again, perhaps his three best friends, his three closest allies. Jesus was feeling the weight on his shoulders, was feeling the anxiety of the moment, was feeling the anguish and agony of what was about to come. The disciples didn't fully know it or didn't fully understand it, certainly. But what Jesus did was he brought them along. He included them. He shared with them that he is greatly troubled. My soul is greatly troubled, Jesus says. And so for us, when we look to Jesus and go, how did Jesus experience this moment? How can I learn from him as I'm experiencing anxiety myself? Jesus included his friends. Do you include your friends? Do you let them know when you're feeling these things? Do you let them know when the weight of the world is on your shoulders? Do you bring them with you? Do you include them? Do you open up to them? This is what we see Jesus do and model for us. Yet so often, I fear, we will pretend all is good. Everything's okay. We're going to just tough it out ourselves, and we don't include those in our life that are closest with us. And that's not what we see in Jesus. He includes his friends. Today, if you're feeling anxious, if the weight of the world feels on you, I would encourage you, find a few people that you know and trust that you can bring into that they might be present with you, that they might pray with you. Not that they're going to fully understand it. Did Peter, James, and John know what was weighing on Jesus? They really didn't. But they were there with him, and Jesus confided in them to say, man, I feel troubled. The weight of the world is on my shoulders. So for us, let's include our friends. The second thing takes us actually back to Philippians. Paul writes this in Philippians chapter 4. And let's not forget, as Paul writes Philippians, that he is in prison. He is not having a great day. He has been arrested and is sitting in jail, most likely in Rome. As Paul writes these words from prison, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice." Paul from prison. "Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Paul from prison, writing to this church in Philippi, says, rejoice. Let me say it again. Rejoice in all things. Jesus, the Lord, is at hand. He says, let your reasonableness be known to all people. What does that really mean, reasonableness? It's kind of like self-control. Let your self-control, let the peace in your life be known to those that are around you, that you're not always upset and mad and angry and irritated all the time. Let your reasonableness be known to all people. Even though you're struggling, even though you're being persecuted, this church in Philippi certainly was. Let your reasonableness be known. And then he says, do not be anxious about anything, but rather, through prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. He says, when you begin to experience anxiety, When those anxious thoughts come, when those anxious thoughts creep into your mind and fill up all the space in your head, and you can't think of anything else, when that begins to happen, Paul says, pray. What's the cue to pray when you're beginning to feel anxious? So for us, again, as we are anxious, maybe you have anxiety today, include your friends, bring your friends along with you, and pray. Don't forget to pray. What do we see Jesus do in the moment where he's feeling anxious? He goes to pray. We always learn, the Bible doesn't contradict itself in that way. As Paul has learned from Jesus, Jesus has modeled that for Paul. And as Paul says, when you feel these anxious thoughts, go to the Lord in prayer. When Jesus felt these anxious thoughts, he went and prayed. For us, don't try to carry it on your own. Don't try to carry the weight by yourself. Don't try to pretend all is good. We are going to feel anxious. It is a part of the human experience to some degree. Some of us may struggle with it more than others, but in those moments, include your friends and don't forget to pray. Go to the Lord to pray. He wants to know. You're not bothering the Lord. You're not bothering your friends if they're actually your friends. They want to be there for you. They want to hear what you have to say. And so as we experience anxiety, I pray we would be, as people who follow Jesus, quick to include our friends and quick to go to the Lord in prayer. Amen.